I live half the year in Franklin, Tennessee, which we now consider our home. When we first moved to Franklin, first week we were there, two amazing things happened. First is we took our children to a restaurant and discovered that mac and cheese is a vegetable. And I cannot begin to tell you what joy that brought to my children. And then the second thing we learned is that you could, as an adult, order a side of Lipitor. And then the second thing that happened was, the second week we were here, is the sirens went off for a tornado. And so we had to go into the basement. Our house was built in 1875, and we went down into the basement with a radio, because that'll really help when it tears the top of your roof off. You know, you can go out listening to, you know, Lady Gaga as you go out into the universe. And my wife, you know, she was uncertain about moving to Tennessee, and we're in the basement with the kids, and she said, "You brought us here to die." She said, "Back in Connecticut, we have pollen alerts." Yeah. But we've grown to love living here. You know, the light falls differently here. You know that sort of dimming of the day at around 5 or 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the summer, just the way that the light, that lemon color kind of falls through the trees and lands on the grass, I've grown to love. And found a home here. And so anyhow, thanks to you for having me here this weekend. It's a joy to be with you. I, a number of years ago, wrote a memoir. It's titled Jesus, My Father, the CIA, and Me. It's one of the longest titles in the history of publishing. It takes up the entire cover of the book. It's the story of my growing up with an alcoholic father who, until I was in high school, I didn't know this until I was in high school, worked for the intelligence services. Beginning in the 1950s, all through the 1980s, he worked for the Central Intelligence Agency while working inside of an American corporation at the same time overseas in England. And it's really the story of the journey of growing up in a family with a father who was a terrible alcoholic. I mean, he was a world-class alcoholic. I mean, this guy, I mean, you know, he went for the gold in that score. And it's also the story of my own journey from alcoholism to sobriety, now with 27 years. And thank you. Thank you. And it's really also the story of the journey, you know, from anger to forgiveness, about how the church, how the people of God helped me to parse the past, and how to live with the present, you know, to carry my load well, right? So I thought I'd share some stories from that memoir with you this morning, some abridged stories. And the first one, I was raised and educated in the Roman Catholic tradition. I went to grammar school with Dominican nuns, which explains why I've had more therapy than Woody Allen. And why every time someone says, "The Lord be with you," I go, "And also with you," like that, you know. Because usually right after that, there was some act of violence to reinforce the behavior, you know. And one of the big watershed moments in the life of a Roman Catholic kid is your first communion mass. You know, that's like a big deal. It's like your first kiss, you know, or getting your license. It's slightly more religious, but it's Or it's supposed to be anyhow. And so this is the story of the morning of my first communion mass, which I pray I brought the right book for. I mean, I kind of know it off the top of my head because I was there for the most part. Where the heck did it go? It's not a long book. Oh, here it is. All right. My boyhood is autumn. The sky is snap cool and azurite blue. My boyhood is elm-lined streets. Every house was white with dark green shutters, American flags affixed to wooden poles waving from their porches. It is riding my 10-speed Raleigh down Ridge Street so fast that it left small tornadoes of dried leaves twisting in the wake of my rear tire. My boyhood is Saturday mornings, standing across the street from the barber shop, spying fathers playfully mussing their sons' hair to get the last remnants of stubble off their heads. Most of all, my childhood is Irish Catholic. On the morning of my first communion, my mother announced that we were going to the Homestead Inn for breakfast. We were speechless. The Homestead was the most expensive restaurant in Greenwich, Connecticut, and that was saying something. A friend of my mother's who knew that our family had fallen on hard times and couldn't afford to buy a car had given us her old Hillman Imp, a two-door British car. The model name accurately describes its interior. The back seat of the Imp was designed to hold two anorexic Scandinavians, not four irritable kids and a diminutive English governess. The Imp was outfitted with a 42 horsepower engine that accelerated from 0 to 60 in 2 days. This is a matter of historical record. When bearing the weight of 4 children, aged 8 to 17, 1 governess, a mother, and a father who was already 3 wins and boozed, the car's engine was sorely tested. On the 1-mile drive to the homestead, it whined. Nay, it screamed. Blue smoke spewed from the tailpipe. And despite a courageous effort on its part, the car could barely travel more than 20 miles per hour. There was one steep hill between the restaurant and us. I don't think my mother had factored into her pre-trip flight check the kind of stress that the pitch of this hill and the weight of 7 people might place on the engine, or the effect it might have on the car and its frame. We were silent. We knew the hill was a make or break proposition. Just past the top of that hill, the 7 of us were a nanosecond away from cheering when there was a loud thump, followed by my father yelling, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph!" Calling on the members of the Holy Family for assistance in emergencies has a long and venerable history among Catholics in extremis. After 2,000 years, there is no empirical evidence to suggest that it helps in any way. It took some time for those of us in economy class to determine what had happened in the forward cabin. But it soon became clear. My father's seat had fallen through the rusted bottom of the car. It was dragging along the pavement, shooting sparks up into the wells of the back seat, threatening to light our socks on fire. My father's rear end was inches from the ground. The collapse of the seat had shot his legs upward so that his kneecaps now nearly touched his face, and he was holding down his cap lest it be damaged. He looked like a fat kid shoved butt first into a waste paper basket. Go over, Annie, he demanded. My mother did not readily admit defeat. Our breakfast plans were scuttled, but she'd get us to my first communion mass or die trying. Hold on, Jack, she said to my father. Stop this car immediately, he said, flailing in an attempt to grab the dashboard. At the bottom of the hill, my mother careened right. An eighth of a mile later, we lurched up in front of the church, more or less in one piece. The seven of us, sweaty and shaken, slowly began peeling ourselves out of the smoking vehicle. It took my brothers several attempts to pull my father out of the car, as bemused parishioners gawked and snickered. A few weeks after my first communion mass, I came home from school and my mother told me that my father had gone on a last-minute business trip to Northern Ireland. It wasn't the last of those last-minute business trips that my father used to take. He didn't come home for 6 months. I learned years later that this was the year the Troubles broke out between pro-British Unionists and pro-Irish nationalists. I'm certain he was in Belfast on assignment for the Central Intelligence Agency. I have a postcard he sent me from Belfast, on which he wrote, "Do you want to know a secret? I love you." I would have given anything for my father's love to not be a secret. Anything. A boy needs a father to show him how to be in the world. He needs to be given swagger, taught how to read a map so that he can recognize the roads that lead to life and the paths that lead to death, how to know what love requires, and where to find steel in the heart when life makes demands on us that are greater than we think we can endure. A young boy needs a father who tells him that life is a loner, who helps him discover why God sent him to this troubled earth, so he doesn't die without completing the errand upon which God sent him here. He may not know it, but from the moment he first glimpses his boy's head crowning in the delivery room, a father makes a vow that with stumbling determination, he will try to get a few of these things right. Boys with fathers who keep their love undisclosed go through life banging from guardrail to guardrail, trying to determine why our fathers kept their love nameless, as if ashamed. We know each other when we meet. One of the many lessons I've learned since I wrote my memoir, and in the hundreds of emails, that you get when you write a book, and it's amazing to me how many men, they didn't write me 2-3 sentence emails. I have another book that people would write 2 or 3 sentence emails or something and say, "I liked your book and thank you, and could you lend me $50 till Friday?" But when you tell your story, like guys write you really long emails in which they tell you theirs. And the hard thing, I'm always honored when that happens. Of course, the problem is you can't send them back a 2 or 3 sentence reply. Because of course what they've shared with you is sacred. It may be digital, it may be electronic, but it's carrying the freight of soul across the air to me, and it's really quite remarkable. And I think I learned that maybe one of the greatest gifts that we can give to another human being, oftentimes the most important gift we can give another human being, is the telling of our stories. It's in the telling of our stories, particularly our stories of how God met us in the vagaries and the suffering of our own lives. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, that's what the point of connection is for human beings, to know that we're not alone. You know, that we struggle together through this adventure we call our lives and our stories. You know, because here's the thing. I could get up here and tell you what it's like to grow up with an alcoholic father. I mean, I can give you the data, okay? But it's in the story. It's the story that carries the freight of the meaning of what it means to be human to other human beings. It's in the telling of the story. The problem is, in my experience as a therapist, as a priest, and just as a human being, and out of my own experience, is that most people don't really fully own their stories. Do you know what I'm saying? Like they don't really acknowledge the depth, even the details of their pasts. You know, somehow or another evaporate into the ether of non-memory. You know. In other words, I think, you know, we're all kind of like creative historical revisionists. You know, we're always kind of changing the details or editing our own stories so that we end up with our preferred narrative, right? Have you ever heard an actor during an interview on some, you know, talk show, you know, they bemoan the fact that some scene in the movie that they were in got cut from the final version? You've probably heard that. They always say, oh, the best scene wasn't in the movie. It ended up on the... Yeah, right. It ended up on the cutting room floor. You know, and I think this is just true, and it's particularly true of men. In the precincts of our hearts, there is a film editor who we have working around the clock, splicing out sections of our past. You know, just snipping away down in the basement of our hearts. And we ask them to do stuff like, would you just do me a favor and turn the soundtrack up on that conversation I had with my dad or with that coach or something, you know, that left a bruise on my soul. So when I remember that, just turn the volume up on the soundtrack so maybe I don't have to hear those words as clearly. Or maybe I can just take out those scenes of betrayal or abandonment or of loss or of regret. And you know, I don't care how charmed a life you've had. If you're a son of Adam and Eve, we all are carrying injuries. We are all injured. I'm a big fan of Flannery O'Connor. And she has a great line. She says, never trust a man without a limp. And I don't. Any guy who comes along to me with a sanitized version of their past, I'm like, I don't know. That doesn't smell good. We all carry injuries with us, but to avoid having to kind of really wrestle with them, to avoid grief and anger, you know, we just sort of selectively forget the details. You know, or what we do is we minimize things, or we sanitize them, or we disinfect them. We too quickly excuse those who wounded us and ourselves for the way that we've wounded others. You know, we just sort of, you know, it's kind of like we keep these memories just beyond the fence line of our awareness all the time. They kind of shimmer just outside of, you know, they're in the peripheral vision, but, you know, we just kind of learn to live with it right here, you know. But here it is, right here. And I've had guys tell me, well, you know, actually, in-depth psychology, what they call that process, it's called narrative smoothing. Isn't that a great phrase? Narrative smoothing. Every time I think about that, it's like someone, you know, I think about my past, and I got some crap in my past, boys. I'm just telling you right now. That it's like ironing it out. I'm like, oh, well, that's a wrinkle I don't want to talk about, you know, right over here. I've had some Baptist friends say that narrative smoothing is called giving your testimony. And in Alcoholics Anonymous, where I go 3 or 4 mornings a week, we call it denial. Or as I like to think of denial, I think a good definition is refusing to know what you know. Refusing to know what you know. And there's an enormous danger for people who consciously refuse to acknowledge the entire truth of their stories. There's a great danger in it when we say no to our lives. Because you see, actually what my friend Richard Rohr says is, what we don't transform, we transmit. Let me say that again. What we don't transform, we transmit. We pass it on. We pass it on to the people we love. Don't even know we're doing it, but we're passing it on. What we don't transform, we transmit. We pass it down. So when we excise or edit out or we banish or split off painful truths so they won't intrude into the present moment, we literally disintegrate. You know, that word integrate, I think comes from the Latin word integritas, meaning wholeness. We literally disintegrate. Parts of us are split off. There are pieces of us that are missing from us. And the truth of the matter is, and this was my experience as someone in recovery now, but it's true for every human being, what we don't own eventually owns us. And that is just spiritual physics. That's the calculus of the universe. What we don't own eventually owns us. We end up with our own addictions, our own crazy behaviors. We're just constantly tripping over our unacknowledged past. Just, I can remember before I got sober, I used to say, I feel like I'm a guy walking through a minefield wearing clown shoes. You know what I mean? I just go through all day stepping on stuff and blowing things up. How many of you saw that, back in 1997, there was a film called Good Will Hunting? You remember? Y'all remember that movie? So I love that movie, and I'm a crier at movies, by the way. Do I have any of you guys criers at movies? Yeah, I got to be squeegeed out of that thing, man. Like, they had to. That was a tough movie for me, in a good way, in a powerful way. If you didn't see it, it's the story of this lower middle class kid or lower class kid named Will Hunting, played by Matt Damon, and he's working as a janitor at MIT. And a professor there discovers that Will has an astronomically high IQ, and he has a savant-like kind of talent for mathematics. But William's problem is that he's a hostage to his past. He grew up in a foster home where he was repeatedly abused, emotionally and physically by his foster parent. And so he has a run-in with the law, and the court orders him to see a psychologist played by Robin Williams. And in those early meetings with Robin Williams, the kid's pretty belligerent. He's an angry, angry kid. And he's very reluctant to look at or own his history. And he's not able to connect the dots, He's just not able to see that the troubles that are plaguing his life can be all tied back, to his history, and that it's screwing up his present. So, do you remember the most moving scene in that movie? I bet you we all, if you saw it, we all had the same most moving scene in the movie that we remember. He's with Robin Williams, and Williams is pressing him to tell him, what happened, asking him, what happened. Finally, Williams just kind of collapses in tears when Robin Williams says to him, "It's not your fault. It's not your fault." He just says it over and over again. And this young boy just weeps, and we weep with him too, don't we? Because, we identify so powerfully with the desire to hear some words that are like a salve like that to our own lives, Like a salve to our own lives. It wasn't your fault, he says to him over and over again. And part of what's so moving about it is that we know in that moment that that kid now, by kind of looking at the past, his story, the shadow side of his story, is now on the journey toward wholeness, but that's kind of the starting gate, is you got to own what's there. You got to own the story in all of its joy and in all of its sorrow. There's a great writer I love, and she writes in this book, she says, in the house of your life, there's always a room with an unmade bed. You know what I'm talking about? There's always a room with an unmade bed. And you can't keep the door closed on it forever, man. Not if you want to get through this life becoming more and more like Jesus. At least that's my experience. Several years ago, I met the legendary American writer Maya Angelou. We were alone together in the green room at a speaking event. I don't know what we were doing in the green room alone with each other, because I was there, and she had this whole, sort of entourage of people who took care of her. She was in a wheelchair, and she had an oxygen tank, and so there was a lot going on. But just the two of us were alone in this green room. And of course, I'm a guy who reads books. I'm in the room with Maya Angelou. That's pretty intense. And she wore these big dark sunglasses, and she was how can I explain what she's like? You ever been with somebody who, when you're with them, have so much gravity that they're incandescent? Like, she was luminous. Her presence, she's like being with royalty. And so she asked me what I was working on. At the time, I was working on this memoir, and can you imagine how sheepish you'd be if Maya Angelou said to you, this Pulitzer Prize winning, Medal of Freedom winning writer and poet who wrote the memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings? You imagine her turning to you and saying, so what are you working on? And then having to tell her you're writing a memoir? That's like saying Stravinsky saying, what are you working on? Oh, it's a little song. So I told her I was working on a memoir, and I swear to gosh, this happened. It was one of the most intense moments of my life, strangest moments and intense moments of my life. She's in her wheelchair, and she grabs my arm. Like the way that, I don't know, she was it was more like a talon, she's like, onto my arm like this. First thing she does is she sings a verse of, sometimes I feel like a motherless child. I am alone in a green room with Maya Angelou. She is singing while holding my forearm, and she has a voice like this. Sometimes I feel... And I'm like, I was not anticipating this blessing, I'm wondering who's going to come in and find her with her hand on me singing songs. And then she gets to the end of the song, and this is what she says to me. She said, son, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. So how do we begin to tell our stories? And by the way, I just want you all to know, if right now you're thinking, this guy is very depressed. No, I came here for a men's weekend. I was having a great time. I'm the most well-adjusted man in this room. I know, because I've been watching you carefully. But let me tell you how I got there. And how it is that our stories can make a difference in the world. You all know what happens when there's a plane crash. Let's say a big plane goes down or a little plane goes down. The transportation investigators come in, and they do this thing called walking the debris field. So what they do is they go through and where the plane crashed, and I guess forensically they can figure out how a plane or what might have happened to cause a plane to crash based on where stuff landed, right? So if the fuselage is over here and there's a wing over here and an engine over there and there's like, this is over here and that's over there. And what they do is they walk the debris field and they have like those little flags that you have when you have invisible fences. I had an invisible fence, but my kids still left the property. That is a separate story. But I say it tangentially just to give you a sense of my well-adjusted behavior. Shock collars for the kids. But they kind of walk through the debris field, and they plant these flags, where stuff is lying, and they just kind of go through and they kind of walk the field. And I tell people that part of the journey to becoming whole, integritas, not being disintegrated people, but integrated people, having our stories in their truth, in their wholeness, and in their fullness, kind of be kneaded into the soul so that you're whole, right? So that you're whole. Part of what that involves is you got to walk your own debris field. And you got to look at your own wreckage. And there's not a man in this room that doesn't have a story of wreckage. And there's not a man in this room that doesn't have a debris field. Not a human in this world that doesn't have one. It may be big. You may have only had a little Cessna. You may have been flying a 777 when it went down. I don't know what your story is. But I just know that everyone's got one. I just know everybody's got one. And you walk your debris field, and here's what you do. You start wandering around. This was my experience getting sober, and I've done this many times in my life. Not many times, but I'm saying it's sort of an ongoing journey. You don't do this once. You walk the field a lot of times. The field looks different at 25 than it does at 55. And you walk the field, and maybe you turn over a piece of wreckage, and you know what you do? You look down to see if you can see the glimmering of grace underneath it. You look for the grace underneath it. Is there some gift underneath the wreckage? I have a spiritual director, and he's at the Society of St. John the Evangelist in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's a monk. And he's also one of the sneakiest guerrilla warfare tacticians I have ever met in my life. He's a very, very calm man. He looks like a monk. He's kind of mousy looking. What you think a monk would look like, right? But if you think this guy makes cheese, and sells them in the gift shop, you got the wrong monk, okay? We don't meet all the time because I can't always get to Cambridge, Massachusetts, so we meet on Skype. I talked him into Skype. I introduced him to Skype. I think I introduced him to electricity too, but anyway, so we meet on Skype sometimes, and I have a big Mac, laptop, and one day I'm whining about my life. I am whining about my life, I am just going through my litany of regret. And he's looking at me, and finally, his face gets up into the screen of my monitor, and so it's like his whole face is like staring at me. And he says to me, Ian, this is your life. These are the terms. So what's the invitation? Well, I understood the first two phrases, but I was uncertain about the whole invitation thing, and I think he saw that I was a little confused. And he said, Ian, in everything in your life, embedded inside of every struggle, there is an invitation from God to do or to become something greater than who and what you are right now. This is your life, Ian. These are the terms. What's the invitation? And so we walk the field and we look for the invitations out of our own struggles, our own wounds, our own unattended sorrows that we all carry as men. We have to, at times, go back and ascribe tears to those things we did not or could not at the time cry for at the moment of its occurrence. Brene Brown is a writer, and she said something once that struck me. She said, owning your story and loving yourself in the process is the bravest thing you'll ever do. Well, I don't know if it's the bravest thing, but it does take great courage. It does take great courage. And it's difficult, to walk that field alone, to listen as we tell and try to make meaning of our stories, because, that's what we want, isn't it? Like we want to know that our stories have meaning, like this had meaning. What was the meaning of that? I think the church, or gatherings like this, or gatherings of people, I think they, at their best, they're places where a climate is created in which people can tell their stories. I think the church should be a safe haven. It should be known as a place where people can come and share their stories with one another in search of the meaning and the grace that can be found in all of them. In all of them. And you need a trusted friend, or you need a trusted counselor, but you really need a family with whom you can do that work. You need people who can bear witness to your story. I'm always amazed. I have a lot of guys that I spend time with, younger guys that I mentor, and I'm amazed at the stories guys say that they're telling me for the first time at 40. And I'm thinking, you carried that? Like I'm the first guy you told that story to? Like, really? How have you done that? And I think a church is a place, and man, if it could just, really, on Sunday mornings when I was running a parish, I could look out of the room and I'd think to myself, how many untold stories are here? How many untold stories? Every day, I know this is possible because every day across America and across the world, groups of guys and men and women get together, and just like me, and in the basement of these churches, we drink really bad coffee. And we tell our stories. And we listen to each other tell our stories. And I often marvel that the greatest theologians in the church are not upstairs in the sanctuary, they're downstairs in the basement. Bunch of alcoholics and addicts, sitting in a circle, rich, poor, young, old, black, white, you name it. We're all in the basement, and everybody's a bozo. It's a level field in the basement, trust me. And while everybody sometimes, excuse me, Bishop, but sometimes upstairs, everybody's got the story, they got the answers to theological ideas about, this thing and the next thing. But downstairs in the basement, the theologians of grace are at work. And they're talking about how God met them in their brokenness, and how in telling their story to another, they can bring healing. They can bring healing. It could be said that in 200 years from now, that America's greatest contribution to world spirituality is Alcoholics Anonymous. You think about the millions of lives that were saved, literally saved. How? In the telling of stories. The whole story. Not the edited version, not the sanitized version, because your secrets will make you sick. The whole story. We once, in Connecticut, I went to an AA meeting once in Connecticut, and it was a big meeting, and we have speaker meetings, right? And so the speaker gets up and they talk about, they just tell their story, And then people get to respond and say, hey, go, that's great, thanks for telling your story, and I really identified with this part, And well, we had a woman come in one time, and she told her story, and It was like the worst thing I'd ever heard. And I've heard some bad stuff. This woman told a story to make your eyes fall back in your head. I mean, about her kid. I mean, it was an awful story. It was so bad that 50 alcoholics at the end of it, we were like brought to silence. Like we were speechless. I mean, you got to work hard to make that happen. You know what I mean? Like there's some people in that room who made some mistakes that were cataclysmic, and we're all like this. You know? Well, usually at the end of a speaker's meeting, after the person speaks, everybody claps. You know, there's this kind of moment of joy, but we were all like this, like, we have a 70-year-old woman in the back of the room. She's got a whiskey voice, like she's been smoking Pall Malls for the last, 80 years or something. And there's dead silence in the room. It is awkward. Nobody is moving. And this poor woman is sitting alone in a chair in front of us, looking back at us, and we don't know. Do you know what I mean? It was an awful moment. From the back of the room, I hear that lady. The word of the Lord. And all the other people in the room said, thanks be to God. In a way, with a little g, you are a gospel. You have a story of how God has met you. It is an unfinished story. It's about the unfinished business of grace. But it deserves to be heard and to be told. Because in so doing, you will reveal to others the nature and character and the love of God that they could not access or know about in any other way unless you told them how God met you. When? And the world is looking for places where they can be heard and hear their stories and hear the stories of others and find healing and reconciliation and meaning and hope. I'm going to close with a story, if that's okay. Is that okay? How long have I gone for? I don't even know. I'm a full... Don't say that. I mean, you just gave a toddler a small firearm. I mean, you have left the gates of hell unguarded when you say that. So I have 3 children. I have a beautiful wife. And we had a home in Dorset, Vermont for many years. And one of the greatest joys of my life is in owning my story is watching my children and watching their stories unfold. And also knowing that my kids go to bed at night not afraid of their father. They go to bed at night not afraid of their dad. What a joy that is. Really, I promise I'm not a depressed person. It's really filled with grace. But it took the telling of the story first, That wasn't easy. So I want to read you the story of end of my book. Just off Route 30 in Dorset, Vermont, a couple miles from our summer home is an abandoned marble quarry that's filled with cold, spring-fed water. It's easily the world's finest swimming hole. Our family made our first visit there on a hot 4th of July when my daughters Kaylee and Maddie were 14 and 11 and my son Aiden was 8. We soon learned that there are 4 jumps at the quarry: the 10-footer, the 18-footer, the 23-footer, and the mother of all jumps, the 40. Our girls take after their mother, a fearless woman whom I once had to beg not to bungee jump off the Victoria Falls Bridge in Zimbabwe. I reminded her I had the parenting skills of Nicolas Cage in the movie Raising Arizona. And that if she perished, I would have sole custody of her children. And she relented. My son Aiden takes after me. Like I was at 8 years old, he was fearful and uncertain about life. This whole jumping off a ledge into the quarry business wasn't appealing to him. Dad, I want to jump in, but my instincts won't let me, Aiden said. What if there are snapping turtles down there, he asked. Buddy, Dad will be standing right here in the water when you jump in. Nothing bad is going to happen to you. Did I mention that we weren't even trying the 10-footer yet? It was more like a 3-footer. And an hour later, I was still trying to coax him into the freezing water. My testicles had receded behind my pancreas. After nearly a full day at the quarry, Aiden still wouldn't jump. Finally, with only moments to spare before we headed home, he closed his eyes and leaped. His sisters, his mom, and I cheered like he had performed a triple gainer at the Olympics. Back the next day, it was a different story. Aiden announced he would try the 10-footer. Dad, you have to wait for me at the bottom, though. I won't jump unless you do, he said. The 5 of us swam across the quarry and scrambled up the marble wall to the 10-footer. My wife jumped, Kaylee jumped, Maddie jumped. Aiden stood on the ledge and quaked. Aiden, we can't wait here forever, I said. There was a line of kids behind him waiting for him to jump. Finally, he made a full-blown leap, a screaming, leg-pedaling, arm-flailing jump. And when he came up, he was more than a little pleased with himself. Aiden, are you ready for the 18-footer? Maddie asked. Skip the 18er. Let's go to the 23-footer, he said, like a holiness preacher drunk on a double dose of the Holy Ghost. A few minutes later, however, he gave up the ghost when he looked down from the 23-foot ledge. My heart fell. I was sure he wouldn't jump. Hey, the kid is 8 years old, and this is 23 feet. He should be proud of jumping the 10-footer, I told myself. But when I looked up, I couldn't see Aiden anywhere, and I soon found out why. With a running start that would have made Evel Knievel proud, Aiden came off the ledge screaming triumphantly. And soon Maddie asked, Dad, can we do the 40? And I looked across the quarry at the legendary 40 so far above us. Not on my watch, I said. But Dad, not another word. Besides, it's time to go home. I dove underwater and headed toward the shore. And I thought the matter of the 40 was settled until Ann and I were doing the dishes after dinner, and she said, Honey, you should let the kids jump the 40. Her suggestion seemed to come out of left field. Not a prayer, I said finally. Well, why not? What's really going on here? She asked. I tossed my dish towel onto the counter. Look, kids get hurt doing this kind of crap. That's what's going on here. 40 feet is a long way to fall, I said. Annie's eyes registered a moment of clarity. Her face softened, and she placed her hand on my cheek. Ian, they're not falling. They're jumping. I lie awake in bed that night. My childhood had been one long free fall. There was no parent waiting in the water, and I got hurt. But Annie was right. Years had healed me. There is a big difference in life between a jump and a fall. A jump is about courage and faith, something the world is in short supply of these days, while a fall is, well, a fall. And maybe fatherhood is about teaching your kids how to do both well. Still, I decided going off the 40 could wait till the following summer. The next day at the quarry, Maddie persuaded me that there was no harm in our just going over to look at the 40. All right, I said, worn down by her nagging. This was an egregious miscalculation. When the 5 of us arrived, there was a group of 10 college-aged boys peering over the ledge, debating whether to jump. There were 4 boys below, sitting on a small island made up of large marble blocks. They had already made the leap and were trying to shame the guys at the top into joining them. "Jump, you wussies," one yelled, taking a swig of beer. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Maddie stride forward, tall and proud. She was the embodiment of Amelia Earhart, Susan B. Anthony, Rosa Parks, Maya Angelou, and Sacagawea. "Maddie, don't you dare," I said. But it was too late. As calm as a heron taking flight, she leaped off the 40. "Dad, it's awesome. You have to do it," she yelled up. "You're grounded until you die," I yelled. It was then that I felt someone tugging at my swim trunks. It was Aiden. "Dad, if you do it, I'll do it." There are moments in a father's life when he realizes that he is facing a decision of irreducible consequence, one that for good or ill will mark his child forever. This was such a moment. The college boys ogled at me like a Greek chorus waiting for the hero's decision. The next thing that happened leads me to believe that maybe some of the more fantastic Bible stories are true. Maybe the Lord can embolden a kid to kill a giant with a slingshot. Maybe the Spirit can make a rascal noble or a coward brave, even if only for a graced instant. I walked off the ledge, and when I surfaced, I was 12 again. Then I remembered Aiden. I looked up at his tiny tan frame standing atop this massive cliff, and I was sore afraid. Then Aiden smiled at me, and I knew in the precincts of my heart that everything in his life and in mine had always been leading up to this moment. He jokingly made the sign of the cross 3 times. And then he jumped. "Yes," I cried, and waited for him to come up. But he didn't. Nausea engulfed me. I imagined one of his feet caught in an angry crib of branches and logs that had long been waiting for him on the bottom of the quarry. I was just taking a deep breath to go down to search for him when 2 feet in front of me, a 65-pound blonde rocket shot up out of the water. He was laughing and blowing water out of his nose all at once. He'd lost a few baby teeth that summer, so when he smiled, he looked like a drunken pumpkin. The Greek chorus on the ledge above cheered. Looking into Aiden's face, I was arrested by a sweet mixture of grief and joy. I knew that the boy who had gone into the water was not the boy who had come out. Behold, the old things had passed away. All things were new. He threw his arms around me while I treaded water to keep us afloat. "Dad, I did it," he said into my ear. "I know," I said, my throat nodding with joy. "Hey, mister, is that your kid?" It was one of the college kids sitting on the island. "He sure is," I said proudly. He held his beer up to Aiden in a toast of respect. "Kid, You've got big balls. Aiden pulled away and looked at me, eyes afire like diamonds, his arms still around my neck. Dad, did you hear him? He asked. I laughed, yeah. He hugged me again. I felt his wet, smooth cheek pressed against my own. I've got big balls. Big brass ones, I whispered back. And we laughed and laughed and laughed until it felt like the water and the marble cliffs and all of creation was laughing with us. I commissioned a local artist to paint an oil of the quarry on a typical summer's day. If you look closely in the left-hand corner of the canvas, there are 3 kids in midair holding hands. They have just leapt off the 40. These are my children. They have jumped, not fallen. Thank you.